Abigail Reed did not cry when they made her kneel. She pressed her lips together, felt the cold marble bite through her skirts, and kept her chin level because her father had taught her that a woman who holds her head up in shame is the only one in the room worth looking at. She did not know yet that a man in the doorway had seen everything. She did not know that what happened next would change both their lives before the summer was out. If you've ever been made to feel small in a room full of people who should have known better, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's begin. The road from Richmond to Whitcomb Hall was 11 miles of red Virginia clay, and Abigail Reed walked the last 2 of them alone. The hired cart had thrown a wheel somewhere past the old mill, and the driver, a sun-beaten man with little patience for summer inconvenience, had unloaded her single trunk at the roadside and told her the estate was straight ahead. Just follow the fence line. She thanked him. She always thanked people, even when they didn't deserve it. Her father had called it grace. Her mother had called it survival. By the time the iron gates of Whitcomb Hall came into view, Abigail's boots were ruined. Her traveling dress was clinging to her in the July heat, and the single pair of good gloves she'd packed were already damp at the fingers. She stopped at the gate and looked up at the house. It was enormous. Not the biggest house she'd ever seen. She'd been to Philadelphia once, and Philadelphia had its monuments, but this house had a different quality. It sat on its hill the way certain men sat in church, back straight, eyes forward, aware of being watched and making no effort to pretend otherwise. She straightened her own back, picked up her traveling bag, and walked through the gate. A groundskeeper watched her from the side of the drive. He didn't offer to help with her trunk, which had been left behind with the cart. She didn't ask him to. "Miss Reed," he said when she'd come close enough. "Yes. You're expected at the side entrance." Abigail looked at the wide front steps, white stone swept clean, flanked by matching urns of summer roses, and then looked at the groundskeeper. "I was told to present myself to Mrs. Whitcomb," she said. "I believe the front door would be appropriate." The groundskeeper's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Whitcomb receives guests at the front. She receives others at the side." The word others landed like a flat stone on still water. Abigail held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you," picked up her bag, and walked toward the front steps. She heard him exhale behind her. She kept walking. The entrance hall of Whitcomb Hall smelled of beeswax and cut roses, and every surface in it announced in one way or another that money had lived here for a very long time. The floors were white marble, veined with gray. The staircase was dark walnut, polished to a mirror shine. Portraits lined the walls, men in formal coats, women in silk, all of them wearing the expression of people who had never once been asked to use the side entrance. A housemaid met Abigail at the door, young, round-faced. She glanced at Abigail's ruined boots, and something moved behind her eyes. Not cruelty, just calculation, the kind a servant learns quickly in a house where noticing the wrong thing can cost you a week's wages. "Mrs. Whitcomb is receiving in the parlor," the girl said. "There are guests." "How many?" "8, ma'am. Perhaps 10. Abigail absorbed that. She'd expected a private introduction. Eleanor Whitcomb had invited an audience. "Lead the way," Abigail said. The parlor doors were already open. That was the first deliberate thing. Open doors meant the hallway could hear everything, and the hallway was not empty. 2 housemaids were folding linens near the window. A footman stood by the stair. A young man in riding clothes leaned against the banister at the far end, polishing a boot with an expression of concentrated boredom. None of them looked at her. All of them watched her. Abigail walked through the doors. The parlor was long and bright summer light, cutting through tall windows and falling in clean strips across the carpet. 10 people were arranged within it, seated women in pale summer gowns. 2 older men standing near the fireplace. A young woman with red hair who looked up from her needlework with frank curiosity. At the far end of the room, in a high-backed chair that might as well have been a throne, sat Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb. She was not what Abigail had expected. She'd expected cold beauty. What she got was something more precise than that. Eleanor Whitcomb was perhaps 60, narrow-shouldered with white hair dressed immaculately, and dark eyes that took in the whole room at once and missed nothing. She wore black silk despite the heat-full morning, still 18 months after her husband's death, and she held a teacup in both hands, with the ease of a woman who had held teacups in both hands her entire life and never once dropped one. She looked at Abigail the way a jeweler looks at a stone someone has brought in off the street. Measuring, categorizing, deciding before a single word was spoken what it was worth. The room went quiet. Abigail walked forward, stopped at the correct distance, and offered a curtsy. Proper depth, steady balance, chin level. Her mother had drilled it into her from the age of 6. You curtsy because it is mannerly, not because you are lesser. Eleanor set her teacup down on the saucer beside her with a small, clean click. Lower, she said. The word was not loud. It didn't need to be. Abigail felt the shift in the room, the held breath, the careful stillness that falls over people who are watching something happen and haven't decided yet whether to intervene or pretend they saw nothing. She lowered herself another inch. Lower. Something cold moved through Abigail's chest. Not fear. Fear would have been simpler. This was something she had no name for yet. A kind of reckoning with the fact that this woman had planned this moment, had set it like a trap, and was springing it now with 10 witnesses and an open door into a hallway full of servants. Her knees bent. The marble through her skirts was cold even in July. One knee touched the floor. The red-haired woman, the one with the needlework, made a small sound. Not a protest, just the involuntary noise of someone witnessing something they hadn't quite expected to see. Abigail kept her chin level. She would not look at the floor. She had decided that the moment her knee went down, whatever happened next, she would not look at the floor. That, said a voice from the doorway, is enough. It was not a shout, it was almost quiet. But it cut through the room the way a knife cuts through silk, not violently, just cleanly, and with the specific quality of something that cannot be undone. Every head in the parlor turned. Nathaniel Whitcomb stood in the doorway. He was tall, not the exaggerated height of Story, but genuinely tall, with the build of a man who worked his own land and didn't apologize for it. His coat was dust-colored, his boots were worn at the heel, and he had the look of someone who had just come in from the South Fields and hadn't stopped to change. He was perhaps 30. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving across the room with a particular kind of deliberate calm, the calm of a man who is controlling something and controlling it hard. Those eyes found his mother. "No guest in this house kneels," he said. Eleanor's expression did not change. "Miss Reed is not yet a guest. She is—" "She walked through my front door." He was already crossing the room. "That makes her a guest." He reached Abigail in 4 strides and offered his hand. Not tentatively, not with the performance of gallantry. Just his hand open steady, the way you offer a hand to someone who has been made to fall and deserves to be helped back up. Abigail looked at it for one breath. Then she took it, and he pulled her to her feet, with the ease of a man who'd done harder things before noon. He did not release her hand immediately. He turned and faced the room, faced his mother, faced the 10 witnesses, faced the open door and the hallway full of careful silence, and let them all understand, without a word, that the moment his mother had constructed was over. "Mrs. Bell," he said without looking away from the room. The housekeeper, a compact woman in gray, who had appeared at the parlor threshold at some point during the previous 2 minutes, stepped forward. "Sir? Please see that Miss Reed's room is prepared, the east guest room." A pause. "With the window that faces the gardens." "Yes, sir." "And her trunk is on the Richmond Road. Send a man." "Right away, sir." He looked at Abigail then. Up close, she could see that he was tired. Not the tiredness of the night before, but the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates. He looked at her the way people look at something they haven't decided what to do with yet, but that they've already decided not to let anyone else handle. "Miss Reed," he said. "Welcome to Whitcomb Hall." "Mr. Whitcomb," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. He did not stay for the tea. He spoke briefly to his mother, 3 sentences low enough that only Eleanor and perhaps the nearest footman could hear, and Eleanor's expression through all 3 sentences was that of a woman eating something she found distasteful but had decided to finish on principle. Then he was gone back through the hall, the front door, the long afternoon outside. Mrs. Bell materialized at Abigail's elbow and guided her gently but firmly out of the parlor and up the staircase. Behind them, the conversation in the parlor resumed slowly. At first, then all at once, the way water fills back into a space when a stone is removed. Abigail walked up the staircase and did not look back. Her legs were shaking. She hadn't noticed that while it was happening, but she noticed it now on the stairs where no one could see her face. Her hands were perfectly still. She'd learned that from her father: in the worst moments, still your hands. The rest of you can tremble all at once. The east guest room was larger than the whole ground floor of the house she'd grown up in. It had a carved walnut bed, a writing table under the window, a small fireplace that wouldn't be needed in July, and as promised, a window that looked out over a garden that was, even from this distance, extraordinarily well tended. Mrs. Bell showed her the washstand, the wardrobe, the bell pull. She did these things with professional efficiency and without commentary. At the door she paused. "The household takes supper at 7, she said. "You'll hear the bell." "Thank you, Mrs. Bell." The housekeeper looked at her. Really looked for the first time. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. The specific recognition of a woman who has navigated difficult houses for a long time and knows what it costs. "There is cold water in the pitcher," Mrs. Bell said. "And I'll have someone bring up a hot supper tray if you'd prefer to rest this evening." Abigail understood what she was being offered. A way out of the dining room. A way to avoid whatever Eleanor had planned for the second act. "That's very kind," she said. "But I'll come down to supper." Mrs. Bell nodded once. "I'll inform the kitchen." The door closed. Abigail sat down on the edge of the carved bed, put her traveling bag on her knees, and breathed. She had come to Whitcomb Hall for one reason. The late Mr. Edmund Whitcomb had, in the last year of his life, written her father a letter promising that Abigail, then 15, now 23, would receive upon her petition to the estate a sum sufficient to establish herself in independence. Her father had saved Edmund Whitcomb's life on a winter road outside Charlottesville in the year 1802, pulling him from an overturned carriage in a January flood with his own hands at risk of his own. Edmund had been grateful enough to put it in writing. Edmund was dead now, and Eleanor, it seemed, had other ideas about what that letter was worth. Abigail reached into her traveling bag and touched the edge of the letter. Edmund's letter, her father's copy carefully wrapped in oilcloth, because she'd known when she packed it that this might not be easy. She did not take it out. She just touched it. Then she straightened up, went to the washstand, and cleaned the Virginia road off her hands. She came down to supper. The dining room was long candlelit and set for a formal table, despite the fact that most of the parlor guests had gone home. 6 remained apparently considered intimate enough to stay. Eleanor sat at the head of the table. A young woman with careful blonde curls, introduced with particular emphasis as Miss Caroline Mercer of the Charlottesville Mercers, was seated at Eleanor's right hand. The seat to Eleanor's left was empty. A footman indicated that this empty seat was Abigail's. She sat in it. Eleanor did not look at her. She was speaking to the man across from her about something involving tobacco prices, and she continued speaking about tobacco prices through the soup course, with the focused attention of a woman who has decided that the conversation she is currently having is the only conversation in the room. Abigail ate her soup. Miss Caroline Mercer, to her credit, did not participate in the performance. She leaned very slightly toward Abigail during the fish course and said quietly enough to be private, "I am sorry about this afternoon. It was not well done." Abigail looked at her. Caroline Mercer was beautiful in the way of women who have been told so since childhood and have managed not to be entirely ruined by it. Her expression was genuine. "It was not your doing," Abigail said. "No, but I saw it and I said nothing." She paused. "I should have said something." You didn't know me. That shouldn't matter, Caroline said simply. And then the conversation at the head of the table required her attention, and she turned away. Abigail looked at her fish. She was not surprised by Eleanor. She had expected opposition had packed for it the way you pack an umbrella for a sky that doesn't look threatening yet, but has that particular quality to it. She had not expected Caroline Mercer to be decent. That was the kind of thing that complicated your picture of a situation. Nathaniel Whitcomb did not appear at supper. He found her later in the library. She had not asked to go there. Mrs. Bell had shown her to it. The books are open to guests if you find yourself wakeful. And Abigail had found herself wakeful at 9 o'clock on a summer evening when the house was still, and the sounds from outside were the sounds of crickets and warm wind and the distant river. She'd taken a lamp and a book she recognized from her father's shelves and settled into a chair near the window, and she'd been there perhaps 20 minutes when the door opened and Nathaniel Whitcomb came in. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Reed." "Mr. Whitcomb." He looked at the book in her hands. "Marcus Aurelius. My father kept a copy. He said it was the best medicine for the kind of days that make you question whether people are worth the trouble." A pause. Then, "Was today that kind of day?" Abigail considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. It had elements. He came in fully, then went to the sideboard near the far window and poured himself something from a decanter. He didn't offer her any, which she noted as either thoughtless or respectful, and she hadn't decided which. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You lifted me off the floor. I don't think apologies are required. I should have been there when you arrived." He turned to face her. "I knew you were coming. I should have been at the door." "Why weren't you—" The question was direct enough that it landed with some weight. He absorbed it. "I was in the south field," he said. "One of the tenant farms had a drainage problem that needed attention before the afternoon rain came. I thought I had time." He paused. "I was wrong." Abigail studied him. There was no performance in this man. That was what she noticed most. He had lifted her off the floor without performance, had spoken to his mother without performance, and he was apologizing now without performance, which was rarer than it should have been in her experience. "The letter," she said. "Your father's letter. Do you know about it?" "Yes." "And the inheritance?" "It is real. My father's wishes are documented. The estate is legally bound." He held her gaze. "Whatever my mother intends the money is yours, Miss Reed. I will not allow anyone to use it as a bargaining chip." "Your mother disagrees." "My mother disagrees with a great many things I intend to do in this life." He said it without heat, simply. "That has not stopped me before." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. "She is testing me," she said. "The parlor today that wasn't cruelty for the pleasure of it. It was a test. She wanted to see whether I would break." Nathaniel was quiet. "She expected me to cry," Abigail said, "or to stand and demand an apology. Either response would have satisfied her. Tears would have proven I was weak. Anger would have proven I was common." She paused. "I did neither." "No," Nathaniel said. "You didn't. So she has not finished testing." She closed the Marcus Aurelius. "I want you to understand that, Mr. Whitcomb. Whatever you said to her in the parlor this afternoon, it settled today's battle. It did not settle the war." He set down his glass. "I know, and I want you to understand something else." She looked at him directly. "I did not come here to be rescued. I came here for what your father promised my father. I intend to leave this house with that, and with my dignity intact, and I do not require anyone to fight my battles for me." Something moved across his face. Not offense. It looked, if anything, like relief. "Then we have an agreement," he said. "Do we— You fight your battles. I fight mine." He picked up his glass again. "When they happen to be the same battle, we'll discuss the terms." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the Marcus Aurelius again. "Good night, Mr. Whitcomb," she said. "Good night, Miss Reed." He left without taking a lamp. The library door closed behind him, and the room was still again. And outside the summer night, pressed warm against the windows, and somewhere in the south wing of Whitcomb Hall, a woman sat in a dark room, with her teacup and her plans, and she had not yet played her strongest card. Abigail read 3 more pages of Marcus Aurelius before she understood, sitting in that chair with the lamplight steady around her, that she had come here expecting a transaction and was going to get something considerably more complicated than that. She was not afraid, but she was paying very careful attention now. In the morning, there was a note slipped under her door. It was written in Eleanor's hand, precise backward slanting ink like a black wire across cream paper. Miss Reed, you will join me for breakfast at 7. Alone. Abigail folded it, tucked it into the oilcloth with her father's letter, and went downstairs at 5 minutes before 7. Eleanor was already at the table. She poured her own tea. She did not pour a cup for Abigail. Abigail sat down, helped herself to the teapot, and waited. Eleanor looked at her across the table with those dark, measuring eyes. The morning light was not kind to Eleanor, not because it revealed weakness, but because it revealed something harder than weakness. The particular loneliness of a woman who has held a position of absolute authority for so long that she has forgotten there are other ways to be in the world. "You are not what I expected," Eleanor said at last. "No," Abigail agreed. "I suspect I am not. Edmund described your father as a modest man, a preacher, a good man in the way that good men are useful in crisis, invisible otherwise." Abigail's jaw tightened. She kept her voice even. "My father was one of the finest men I have ever known. I don't doubt it." Eleanor's tone was not cruel in that moment. It was almost detached. "I simply observe that the daughters of good men are not always reliable, in terms of their station, their understanding of the world." "And what is my station in your understanding?" Eleanor set down her teacup. "You are a preacher's daughter from a dead congregation in a county that nobody talks about anymore. You have one dress that fits you properly, no connections of value, and a letter from a dead man that a clever lawyer could challenge for the next decade." She tilted her head very slightly. "What you have, Miss Reed, in the only currency that matters in this house is nothing." Abigail let that settle. Let it sit in the space between them where Eleanor had put it. Then she said, "And yet, here I sit." Eleanor looked at her. "At your breakfast table," Abigail said. "Invited by you, this morning, the morning after you asked me to kneel." She held Eleanor's gaze. "If I were nothing, Mrs. Whitcomb, you would not have written that note." The clock on the mantel ticked 7 times. Eleanor picked up her teacup. "Eat your breakfast, Miss Reed," she said, and something in her voice just barely, just at the edge, had changed. The breakfast ended without ceremony. Eleanor finished her tea, set the cup on the saucer with that same precise click Abigail had heard in the parlor the day before, and excused herself to attend to correspondence. She left without another word about knees or stations or the inheritance. She left the way a general leaves a field after an opening engagement unhurried, giving nothing away, already thinking about the next move. Abigail ate the rest of her toast alone and thought about what Eleanor had not said, because it was the unsaid thing that mattered. Eleanor had laid out her case with the cool precision of a woman who had won arguments her entire life. The station, the dress, the dead congregation, the letter a clever lawyer could challenge. All of it true. All of it designed to make Abigail feel the dimensions of her situation as if they were walls closing in. But Eleanor had not mentioned Nathaniel. Not once. In a conversation calibrated down to every syllable, she had not said his name, which meant he was the thing she was not ready to address yet. Abigail tucked that away and went upstairs to write a letter to her cousin in Richmond, informing her that she had arrived safely and that the house was exactly what she had expected and nothing like it at all. She did not sleep well that first night, but she did not expect to. By the 3rd morning, the house had taken on a pattern the way all houses do when you live inside them long enough. Eleanor rose early and received correspondence in her sitting room until 9. Nathaniel left for the fields before 6 and rarely came back before late afternoon, smelling of sweat and good soil, and the particular tiredness of a man who does real work. The household ran with quiet efficiency under Mrs. Bell's steady management. The guests who had been in the parlor that first afternoon came and went in pairs and groups, and every one of them found some occasion to look at Abigail with the particular combination of curiosity and pity that she had come to recognize as the Virginia aristocracy's idea of good manners. She bore it. She had borne worse. What she had not anticipated was Samuel. She found him on the 4th day, sitting at the top of the east staircase, with his back against the banister and a book open in his lap that he was clearly not reading. He was perhaps 9 years old, slight, with Nathaniel's jaw and Eleanor's dark eyes, and the specific expression of a child who has spent a great deal of time being quiet in rooms where adults talked over his head. He looked up when he heard her step. "You're Miss Reed," he said. "I am." "And you're Samuel." "Mrs. Bell said I wasn't to bother you." "Mrs. Bell wasn't consulted," Abigail said, and sat down on the step beside him. "What are you reading?" He showed her the cover. It was a natural history of the Virginia River Basin, dense with illustrations of fish and marsh grasses, an unusual choice for a 9-year-old. "Do you like it?" she asked. "I like the pictures," he said. "The words are too long." He paused. "My father liked fish. He used to take me to the river." Abigail heard the past tense land between them. "Your father was Mr. Whitcomb's brother," she said carefully. "He died when I was 6. Samuel said it the way children say hard things plainly without armor, because they haven't yet learned to put armor on the places that hurt. "Uncle Nathaniel says I can still go to the river whenever I want. Grandmother says the river is not suitable for a boy of my position." There it was. Even here, even with a 9-year-old, the house made its argument about position. "What do you think?" Abigail asked. Samuel considered this with the gravity of someone who had been told his opinion didn't matter often enough that he'd started to believe it. "I think I like the river," he said, "but I don't go much anymore." Abigail looked at the fish illustrations and thought about a boy who had been taught to want less than he wanted. "Would you show me where it is?" she asked. "The river." He looked up at her, and something woke in his face, not happiness exactly, but the possibility of it. Now. Why not now? They went by the kitchen path which Mrs. Bell witnessed, but did not stop, and Abigail filed that away as information about whose authority actually ran the quieter hours of Whitcomb Hall. The river was a 20-minute walk through summer grass, and Samuel talked the entire way about the fish, about his tutor who smelled of old paper, about a colt in the south stable that no one had named yet, and that he had been secretly calling Jupiter for 3 weeks. He talked the way children talk when they haven't talked freely in a while, in a tumble, circling back, not stopping to check whether anyone was still listening. Abigail listened. Every word. At the riverbank, Samuel crouched down and pointed at something below the surface, a shadow moving against the current impossibly slow. "Grandfather used to say this river ran through the blood of everyone who ever owned land on it," he said. "He told me that's why we had to protect it." He paused. "Grandmother says the same thing about the family, that it runs in the blood and has to be protected." He looked up at her. "Do you think that's true? That some things have to be protected just because of what they are?" Abigail looked at the river. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things are worth protecting because of what they do, not what they are." Samuel thought about that. "What's the difference?" "Your grandfather's river protects the land around it. Keeps it wet, keeps things growing. That's worth protecting." She paused. "A river that just sits there and says, 'I am a riverboat' to me, that's just water with an attitude." Samuel laughed. It was the first genuine sound she'd heard in the house that didn't come with a price attached. They stayed by the river for an hour. When they came back, Eleanor was standing at the top of the kitchen path. She looked at Samuel, then at Abigail, then back at Samuel in a way that made the boy's laughter vanish like heat off summer stone. "Go inside," Eleanor said to Samuel. He went. Eleanor looked at Abigail. "You will not take him from the grounds without informing the household," she said. "He is not well supervised by strangers." "We were in sight of the house the whole time," Abigail said. "That is not the point." "Then what is the point, Mrs. Whitcomb?" Eleanor's eyes did not waver. "The point is that Samuel is a Whitcomb. His time, his company, and his confidence are not available to those whose place in this house has not been established." A pause. "Do I make myself clear?" Abigail held her gaze for the count of 5. Then she said, "Perfectly." Eleanor turned and went back inside, and Abigail stood in the kitchen path and breathed through her nose and thought about Marcus Aurelius and whether he had ever had a morning quite like this one. She decided he probably had. That evening Nathaniel found her in the garden after supper. The light was going gold and long the way Virginia summer evenings do, like the day is reluctant to end and keeps drawing itself out in color. He came around the boxwood hedge and stopped when he saw her, and she had the impression he'd been looking for her specifically, which he confirmed by saying, "I heard about the river." "I took Samuel for a walk," she said. "He showed me a fish. My mother told me you disregarded the household's instructions about his supervision." "Your mother told me he couldn't walk with strangers. By the time we came back, we were not strangers." She looked at him. "How does she do it?" "Do what?" "Make it sound reasonable. Every restriction. Every rule. She frames it so that arguing against it makes you sound irresponsible." She paused. "The boy hasn't been to the river in months, Mr. Whitcomb." Nathaniel said nothing. "He called the colt in the South Stable Jupiter," Abigail said. "Has been calling it that for 3 weeks, in secret, because someone told him the colt wasn't his to name." She watched his face. "You did not know that." He hadn't. She could see it. "He needs someone to talk to," she said. "He's 9 years old, and this house is very quiet and very correct, and I think he forgets sometimes that he's allowed to laugh." Nathaniel looked out at the garden. Something in his jaw had gone tight. "My brother died," he said 3 years ago. "Samuel has been here since. My mother—" He stopped. Started again. "She loves him, in the way she knows how to love things. Which is to say, she protects what she values in the only way she knows, by controlling the conditions around it. That's not love. That's curation." He looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was accurate," he said. "Don't apologize for it." They stood in the garden for a moment in the fading light, and then he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Why are you still here?" The question surprised her. "I beg your pardon?" "You could have left. Yesterday. The day before. You have enough pride to have walked out of that parlor and not looked back, and you have the intelligence to know you could fight the inheritance from Richmond just as well as you can fight it from this house." He faced her. "So why are you still here?" Abigail thought about it. The true answer was the one she was least prepared to speak out loud, that she had decided on the east staircase with a 9-year-old boy and his book of fish illustrations, that this house needed something that she had, and that leaving before she'd given it would be a kind of defeat she couldn't accept. But she didn't say that. Instead, she said, "Because your mother asked me to kneel in front of 10 witnesses, and I have not yet decided how that ends." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, just the shape of one. "Fair enough," he said. He left her in the garden, and she stood there in the gold light and thought that she was in considerably more trouble than she'd packed for. 3 days later, Miss Caroline Mercer arrived to stay. She came with 2 trunks, a lady's maid, and a collection of summer hats that said, without saying anything, that she had been invited to stay long enough to matter. Eleanor greeted her in the front hall with more warmth than Abigail had seen her show any living person, took both her hands, and called her "My dear Caroline," in the tone of a woman announcing a verdict. Abigail was in the upstairs hallway when it happened. She watched through the railing and understood clearly what was being communicated. Caroline Mercer was the answer Eleanor had already selected. Abigail's presence was the question Eleanor intended to eliminate. Caroline looked up and saw her through the railing. She did not look away. She gave a small direct nod, not apologetic, not guilty, just honest, and then looked back at Eleanor and answered something about the journey from Charlottesville. At dinner that night, Caroline sat at Eleanor's right. Abigail sat at Nathaniel's left. The geography of the table was its own argument. Nathaniel spoke to both of them with equal courtesy, which seemed to frustrate Eleanor in ways she controlled by speaking more than usual about a neighbor's new mill and whether the construction of it was likely to affect the water level upstream. Caroline engaged with the subject intelligently. Abigail added one observation about riparian rights that she'd read in her father's law books, and Nathaniel looked at her with an expression of such undisguised interest that Eleanor reached for her water glass with the deliberate calm of someone preventing themselves from doing something else. After dinner, Caroline fell into step beside Abigail in the hallway. "She's going to make it very uncomfortable," Caroline said without preamble. Abigail looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't. That's why I'm saying it." Caroline kept her voice low and even. "She invited me because she thought my presence would make Nathaniel feel the comparison. It won't. Anyone who has spoken to him for more than 10 minutes knows that Nathaniel Whitcomb cannot be managed through comparison." She paused. "But she'll try other things." "Why are you telling me this?" Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Because I sat in that parlor," she said finally. "And I didn't say a word, and I've thought about that every morning since." She looked at Abigail directly. "I don't want her to use me as a weapon against you without your knowing it." Abigail studied her. There was nothing performative in this woman. Whatever Caroline Mercer was, she was not someone who said things she didn't mean. "Thank you," Abigail said. "Don't thank me, just be careful." Caroline glanced toward the parlor where Eleanor's voice could be heard directing a housemaid about something with lamps. "She has more patience than you think, and she doesn't lose things she's been holding for 20 years. What does that mean? But Caroline had already moved away, and Abigail was left standing in the hallway with a warning she only half understood, and the particular feeling of a floor that might be solid or might be a door, and she couldn't tell the difference yet. The next morning, a box arrived at Abigail's room. Mrs. Bell delivered it without comment, set it on the writing table, and said only, "Mrs. Whitcomb requests that you wear this for the Hargrove supper on Thursday." Abigail opened the box. Inside was a gown. It was perfectly made pale blue silk, fashionable cut, the kind of thing that would look lovely, and cost more than her father had earned in a year. It was also unmistakably the kind of gown that said she came to us with nothing, so we dressed her. The kind of gown that would make every woman at the Hargrove supper look at Abigail and see not herself, but Eleanor Whitcomb's generosity, Eleanor's taste, Eleanor's charity. Abigail looked at the gown for a long time. "Please tell Mrs. Whitcomb," she said, "that I am grateful for her consideration, and that I have a suitable gown for Thursday." Mrs. Bell's expression didn't flicker. "She will ask which one." "The ivory muslin," Abigail said, "with the alterations I made last spring." She paused. "It's appropriate." "She won't think so." "No," Abigail agreed. "She won't. Mrs. Bell picked up the box and left, and Abigail sat down at the writing table and looked out the garden window and thought about how quietly this particular war was being fought, and how many fronts it had opened in less than a week, and whether she had enough ground left to hold. The letter came that afternoon, delivered not by Mrs. Bell, but by a young footman she didn't recognize, slipped under her door while she was reading, so that she heard the whisper of paper on wood, and looked up to find it already there, already waiting. She picked it up. It was one page Eleanor's backward slanting hand, and it was not a request. Miss Reed, it would be in the interest of all parties if you would commit to writing your understanding that your presence at Whitcomb Hall is temporary in nature, and that you do not intend to encourage any attachment on the part of my son that would complicate the resolution of the matter between us. This is a reasonable request. I trust you will treat it as such. Abigail read it twice. Then she folded it, added it to the oilcloth with her father's letter and Eleanor's breakfast note, and went to find Nathaniel. She didn't have to go far. He was in the south hall coming up from the fields pulling off his work gloves when she came around the corner and he saw her expression and stopped. "What happened?" he said. She held out the letter. He read it. The muscle in his jaw did the thing she'd started to recognize as his substitute for anger, tight, controlled, held absolutely still. "She asked you to—" He stopped. "She asked me to put in writing that I won't encourage you," Abigail said. "As though this is something I—" She stopped herself. Breathed. "I need you to understand, Mr. Whitcomb, that I have not been encouraging anything. I came here for a legal obligation your father put on paper. I have not—" "I know," he said. "Then you understand why this letter is—" "An insult," he said. "Yes, I understand exactly what it is." He folded the letter with hands that were very steady. "What do you intend to do?" "I intend to do nothing," Abigail said. "I will not write what she's asking. And I will not confront her about asking it because that is what she wants. She wants me angry. She wants me reactive." She looked at him. "But I need to know something." "Ask. Is she going to use this house to make the legal process difficult?" She held his gaze. "I need to know honestly. Can she delay the inheritance? Can she introduce obstacles that a Richmond lawyer would take a year to untangle?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "She could, if she chose to." He looked at her. "The estate's solicitor is a man named Pharaoh. He has worked for this family for 30 years. If my mother instructed him to raise questions about the original letter—" "How long?" "A year, perhaps 18 months. The number landed in her chest like something dropped from a height. "I don't have 18 months, she said. He looked at her sharply. And there it was. The thing she hadn't meant to say. The thing she'd been careful to not say, the edge of the real situation that she'd been keeping behind her composure for 5 days. "Miss Reed," he said slowly, "what exactly is the situation in Richmond?" She didn't answer immediately. She had come here prepared to be strong. She had packed composure and her father's letter and 3 weeks of careful rehearsal for every argument Eleanor might make. What she had not packed, what she had chosen not to bring, because bringing it felt like weakness, was the full truth of how narrow her margin was. Her father's congregation had folded 2 years before his death. The house they'd lived in had belonged to the church, and she'd had to leave it within 3 months of the funeral. Her cousin had taken her in truly generously without complaint, but her cousin had 4 children, and a 5th coming, and the house was already full past full. Abigail had 6 months, perhaps 7. Before she was a burden too heavy to carry, and too loved to put down, and she would have to find another answer to a question that only had one answer: the inheritance. "My situation," she said carefully, "is manageable." Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. He was not a man who pushed, she'd learned that. He waited. "My situation," she said again, and this time her voice was a degree steadier, "is such that 18 months is not a number I can afford." He said nothing, just nodded once. Then he looked at his mother's letter in his hand and made a decision that she could see moving through him, could see the way decisions move through people who make them the right way from the inside out. "I'm going to speak to Pharaoh directly," he said. "Tomorrow, in Richmond. I will make it clear that the estate recognizes the obligation in full and that there is no ambiguity to be resolved." He met her eyes. "That removes my mother's leverage over the legal process." "She will not be pleased." "No. She'll find another way to fight." "She will," he agreed. "But she'll have to fight on ground that costs her something." He held out the letter. "Would you like this back?" Abigail thought about it. Then she shook her head. "Burn it," she said. "I don't want it in my room." He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that she did not analyze because she was not ready to analyze it. "I'll be back from Richmond by Thursday," he said, "in time for the Hargrove supper." "I'll be wearing ivory muslin," she said. Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I'll know which one you are." He left. She stood in the south hall and listened to the sounds of the house around her, the kitchen below, the garden outside, somewhere upstairs, a door closing with Eleanor's particular careful precision, and understood that the ground had shifted in the last 10 minutes in ways she hadn't controlled. She wasn't sure if she was glad about it. She was still trying to decide when Samuel appeared at the end of the hall, book under his arm, and said without preamble, "Are you staying?" She looked at him. "Grandmother thinks you'll leave," he said. "She told Mrs. Bell that women like you always calculate and then go when the calculation doesn't favor them." His expression was serious. "I don't think you'll go." "Why not?" Samuel thought about it with that particular grave care of his. "Because you sat with me by the river," he said. "And you didn't ask me anything about the family or the house or the money. You just listened to me talk about Jupiter." He looked at her steadily. "People who want things from this house don't do that." Abigail looked at this 9-year-old boy who had been living in a house full of adults, conducting warfare in polite sentences, and who had seen through all of it with the simple accuracy of someone who hadn't yet learned not to. "I'm staying," she said. Samuel nodded once, as though this confirmed something he'd already believed. Then he held out his fish book. "There's a chapter on the kingfisher," he said. "I thought you might want to read it. They mate for life, apparently." Abigail took the book. She was still holding it when somewhere in the upper floors of Whitcomb Hall, she heard Eleanor's door open and then very deliberately close. Nathaniel came back from Richmond on a Wednesday, a full day earlier than expected, and the fact that he came back early told Abigail everything she needed to know about how the conversation with Pharaoh had gone before he said a single word about it. He found her in the library. She had made it her habit mornings, the quiet hour before the house fully woke, and he came in without knocking, which he had never done before, and stood in the doorway for a moment with the look of a man who has been writing hard and thinking harder. "It's done," he said. "Pharaoh won't move against the inheritance. I made the estate's position clear." Abigail set down her book. "How did he receive that?" "He received it the way men receive instructions they don't want from someone they can't refuse." Nathaniel came in, dropped into the chair across from her, and ran a hand over his face. "He'll honor the obligation. There won't be legal delay." "And your mother?" He looked at her. "She knows." "When did she find out?" "Before I got back." A pause. "I believe Pharaoh sent word." Abigail absorbed that. 30 years of service, and Pharaoh had sent word to Eleanor before the dust from Nathaniel's horse had settled, which meant Eleanor had not been waiting to discover her leverage was gone. She'd watched it happen in real time. "How was she?" Abigail asked. "Quiet," Nathaniel said. "Which is worse." He was right. In the 3 days since Eleanor had been precisely, beautifully, dangerously quiet. She ate supper with the composure of a woman who has decided that composure itself is a weapon. She spoke to Abigail when occasion required it, and otherwise moved through the house as though Abigail were a piece of furniture she'd decided to stop noticing. She gave Caroline Mercer more of her attention, more warmth, more of the particular maternal approval she dispensed like a controlled substance, never too much, always enough to communicate what she intended. And she said nothing about the Hargrove supper, not the gown, not the seating arrangements, not who would ride in which carriage or stand in which group or be introduced to which families. Nothing. That was how Abigail knew something was coming. The Hargrove estate sat 12 miles east of Whitcomb Hall, and the Hargroves threw the largest summer entertainment in the county. 200 guests, minimum, a full orchestra supper, laid in 3 rooms. It was the kind of event where Virginia made its social arguments in public, and everyone present understood that the stakes were real and the memory was long. The evening of the supper, Abigail dressed herself without assistance. She had politely declined the offer of Eleanor's housemaid. Her ivory muslin was pressed and ready. The alterations she'd made herself, a tuck at the waist, a new length at the hem sitting cleanly. She opened her traveling case and lifted out the only piece of jewelry she'd brought, her mother's pearls. Single strand, modest, the clasp repaired twice and showing it. They were not fashionable. They were not impressive. They were her mother's. She fastened them at her throat and looked at herself in the glass and thought, "This is what I have. It is enough." In the front hall, Caroline Mercer was already waiting in pale green silk that fit her like it had been sewn on. She looked at Abigail at the ivory muslin at the pearls, and something moved across her face that was not pity. It was closer to respect. "The pearls were your mother's," she said. "Yes." "Wear them well," Caroline said simply. Eleanor came down the staircase in black as always, and her eyes moved over Abigail with the swift efficiency of a woman who misses nothing and shows nothing. She said, "The carriage is ready," and walked to the door, and that was all. Nathaniel was at the bottom of the steps waiting. He looked at Abigail in the ivory muslin, at the pearls. He held her gaze for one beat longer than courtesy required, and then he offered his arm to his mother and handed both women into the carriage and climbed in last, and the four of them rode 12 miles to the Hargrove estate, in the particular silence of people who are all thinking about the same thing, and none of them willing to say it first. The Hargrove entrance hall smelled of candles and hothouse flowers, and 200 people who had spent the afternoon getting dressed for each other. Abigail heard the sound before she felt it, that shift in crowd noise that happens when someone new walks in, and the room decides in the span of 2 seconds what it thinks of them. She walked in behind Eleanor and felt the decision being made. She kept her chin level. She had learned in the past week and a half that her chin was the most important thing she owned in this county. Mrs. Hargrove, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, the kind of Southern hostess who ran her home with the efficiency of a military campaign, received them at the door and kissed Eleanor on both cheeks, and said warmly, "And this must be Miss Reed, Edmund's girl." She took Abigail's hand with the grip of someone who means it. "Your father was a good man. Edmund spoke of him to me more than once." Abigail felt something tighten in her throat. "Thank you, ma'am. Come in, come in." Mrs. Hargrove's attention was already moving to the next arrival, because a hostess of 200 can only stay in one place for so long, and she swept away, and Abigail was left standing in the Hargrove entrance hall with her mother's pearls, and the knowledge that at least one person in this room had heard her father's name spoken well. She held on to that. The first hour was this hour of circling the careful social navigation of a large room, where conversations opened and closed like small transactions, and everyone was simultaneously talking and calculating. Abigail was introduced to perhaps 30 people. She spoke pleasantly to all of them. She smiled where smiling was expected, listened where listening was required, and remembered every name, because her father had taught her that remembering names is the only truly free gift you can give a person. 2 things she noticed. Caroline moved through the room easily, warmly, with the natural confidence of someone who had done this since childhood and genuinely liked people. And Eleanor moved through it differently, deliberately choosing her placements like a chess player, always in sight of either Nathaniel or Abigail, never both at once. At some point in the first hour, a woman Abigail didn't know appeared at her elbow. 50s, thin-lipped, the kind of woman who delivers damage with a smile and considers it conversation. "Miss Reed," she said sweetly. "How brave of you to come. I understand the journey from your previous situation was quite taxing." "Not at all," Abigail said. "Virginia roads are beautiful in summer, and the Whitcombs have been so generous, taking you in like this." The woman touched Abigail's arm with 2 fingers. "Eleanor has always had such a large heart for charity." Abigail looked at her directly, not coldly, just directly in the way that makes certain people feel the temperature of what they've just said. "Mrs. Whitcomb has been a gracious hostess," Abigail said. "As I'm sure you know, she and my late father's benefactor were married for 35 years. The families have a long acquaintance." She smiled. "It's lovely to finally put faces to names. Excuse me." She moved away and found a quiet space near a window, and breathed once, twice, and then Samuel's voice came back to her. "People who want things from this house don't do that," and she held on to that too. The dancing began at 9. Nathaniel led Caroline Mercer out for the first set as society expected. This was not cruelty on his part. It was the kind of obligatory social choreography that everyone in the room understood, and Caroline danced with him the way she did everything competently, pleasantly, without pretension. They made a handsome pair. Everyone thought so. Eleanor, standing near the far wall with her teacup, thought so loudly enough that you could feel it from across the room. Abigail watched for approximately 30 seconds, and then turned to speak with Mrs. Hargrove's daughter about a book they had both apparently read, because standing and watching Nathaniel dance was not something she intended to do, and she would not give Eleanor, or the thin-lipped woman, or anyone else in the room, the satisfaction of seeing her face during it. The first set ended. The second set formed. Abigail was in the middle of a sentence about Mansfield Park when she felt the shift, that thing that happens in a room when someone is moving through it with purpose and the crowd adjusts around them. She looked up. Nathaniel was crossing the ballroom, not toward his mother, not toward Caroline, not toward the refreshment table or any of the clusters of men near the windows. Toward her. The room noticed. The room always noticed these things. That was the entire point of rooms like this one. They were built for noticing. Conversations slowed. Heads turned by fractions. The orchestra finished a phrase and paused, and in that pause, Nathaniel Whitcomb walked across the Hargrove ballroom in full sight of 200 people and stopped in front of Abigail Reed. He held out his hand. Abigail looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She said quietly enough that only he could hear, "If I take your hand, your mother will make someone pay for it." Nathaniel said just as quietly, "Then she may begin with me." Abigail looked at him for the length of one breath. Then she took his hand. He led her onto the floor, and the music began again, and Abigail was aware of everything. The weight of 200 pairs of eyes, the particular silence that had fallen over the corner of the room where Eleanor stood, the warmth of Nathaniel's hand at her waist, the fact that her own hands were completely steady, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her. This is a line being drawn. Right here, right now, in front of everyone. They danced. Nathaniel did not make speeches while they danced. He did not perform. He held her correctly, led her clearly, and at the turn of the first phrase said quietly, "You're counting." "I beg your pardon." "You're counting the beats. I can feel it." He turned them. "You don't need to." "I haven't danced in 2 years," she said. "I know. You're doing fine." She stopped counting. They danced the rest of the set in the kind of quiet that is not silence, but something better. Two people moving together without needing to narrate it. The room watched. The room understood. The room made the calculation that rooms like this make and filed it under, things that cannot be undone. When the music stopped, Nathaniel held her hand a moment longer than the conclusion of a dance required. Just a moment. Then he released it, and they separated, and Abigail walked to the refreshment table and drank a glass of water, and felt her heart beating considerably faster than the situation strictly warranted. Caroline appeared beside her. "Well," she said without heat. "I know," Abigail said. "Eleanor hasn't moved." Abigail looked. Caroline was right. Eleanor was still standing in her corner, teacup in hand, with the expression of a woman processing information she has received and is deciding what to do with it. Not angry. Something colder than anger. Strategic. "She planned something for tonight," Abigail said quietly. "She's been too quiet all week." "Yes," Caroline said. "I think so too." She paused. "Abigail, there's something I've been trying to decide whether to tell you." Abigail looked at her. Caroline set down her glass with the careful placement of a woman choosing her words with equal care. 3 days before you arrived at Whitcomb Hall," she said, "I was here at the Hargroves for supper. Eleanor was also here, and she—" a breath. "She was telling people about a letter, not Nathaniel's father's letter, a different letter, one that she said was written by your father." The refreshment table was suddenly very loud. "She didn't show it," Caroline said quickly. "She just mentioned it, in the way she mentions things that she intends to use later. I didn't know what it meant at the time. I only after I met you, after I understood what this was about, I put it together." She looked at Abigail directly. "Whatever is in that letter, she's been carrying it for a while, and tonight she has an audience," Abigail said. "Yes." Abigail set down her water glass, picked it back up, set it down again. "Her father, A letter. Written by her father. Her father had been a preacher, a good man, an honest man. She had staked her entire presence in this house on that. She had defended him to Eleanor at breakfast not a week ago. She had said one of the finest men I have ever known with her whole chest behind it. What had he written? What had he written that Eleanor Whitcomb had been carrying for long enough to mention at dinner parties before Abigail had even arrived? "Thank you," Abigail said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for it. She found Nathaniel in the next 20 minutes, which required navigating through 3 conversations and the thin-lipped woman again, who this time had the wisdom to only smile. Nathaniel was near the garden doors, speaking to a man about something agricultural, and he read her face the moment she came close enough. He excused himself from the conversation without ceremony. "What happened?" he said. "Your mother has a letter," Abigail said. "Written by my father. She's been carrying it for some time, long enough to mention it to people before I even arrived here." She held his gaze. "Do you know about it?" He was quiet. 1 second. 2. "Nathaniel." She used his given name without thinking. Neither of them acknowledged it. "Do you know about it?" "Yes," he said. The word landed like a stone on still water. "How long?" she said. "I found out 2 months before you arrived." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been holding something he didn't want to hold. "My mother found it in my father's desk after he died. He had kept it for 20 years. "What does it say?" He was quiet again. "Tell me," she said. "Your father was not always a preacher," Nathaniel said. Before his calling when he was young, perhaps 2021, he was involved in a land dispute in another county, a piece of property he'd been promised by a relative that was also claimed by another family. He paused. "There was a fire on that property. Your father was present. He signed a document afterward, a sworn statement claiming he had not been on the land that night." Abigail waited. "My father believed otherwise," Nathaniel said. "He wrote it down. He had been the magistrate who took the statement, and he spent 20 years believing that your father had lied, and he never came forward because your father had by then become a minister, and was by all other accounts a good man, and my father could not reconcile the two things, and chose silence." He looked at her. "When he wrote you the inheritance letter, he said in private correspondence that only my mother found that he was writing it partly as a form of restitution for the role he'd played in letting the original lie stand." The room around Abigail was full of music and conversation, and 200 people who had no idea what was happening 6 feet from the refreshment table. "Was anyone hurt?" she said. "In the fire?" "Yes." "No," he said. "The property was unoccupied. The family that claimed it used the fire as evidence in the dispute, but—" He stopped. "No one was hurt." Abigail breathed. She thought about her father. 21 years old, frightened, young, a boy who had done a wrong thing and spent the rest of his life trying to be a better man. She thought about the way he prayed, the particular quality of his prayers, not confident, not triumphant, but grateful. Always grateful. She had thought it was the gratitude of a man who knew what grace meant. She had been right. She just hadn't known the whole shape of it. He wasn't a lesser man because of it, Nathaniel said. He was— "I know who he was," Abigail said. Her voice was not sharp. It was something else, certain in the way that certainty sometimes sounds like grief. "I know exactly who he was. I watched him for 23 years. I know what kind of man makes that kind of mistake, and what kind of man spends his whole life after it trying to be better." She looked at Nathaniel. "Your mother intends to use this tonight." "I believe so. To destroy my credibility. To make every person in this room question whether the daughter of a man who lied under oath deserves anything this house owes her." She paused. "And to make you see me differently." Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "It won't." "You can't know. I've known about this letter for 2 months, he said. "You've been in my house for 11 days. I watched you take a 9-year-old boy to the river to look at fish. I watched you refuse a gown designed to humiliate you. I watched you sit across from my mother at breakfast and hold your ground without raising your voice." He took 1 step closer. "I know what I see." Abigail looked at him. She had come to Whitcomb Hall for a legal obligation and a sum of money and the right to stand on her own ground. She had not come for this thing standing in front of her in the Hargrove ballroom, looking at her like she was something to be chosen. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should be aware that your mother is watching us right now." "I know. And that what you're about to do will have consequences." "I know that too." He reached into his coat pocket. "I have been carrying this for a week," he said. "I was going to find a better moment. I suspect my mother is about to eliminate the option." He opened his hand. In his palm was a ring. Simple. Gold. A small oval stone the color of deep water. Abigail stared at it. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "Not the Whitcomb grandmother. My father's mother. She was a schoolteacher from Fredericksburg who married a man her family considered entirely unsuitable and spent 52 years proving them wrong." He paused. "My father gave it to me 3 years ago. He said I would know when it was right." Abigail looked up from the ring to his face. "This is not a rescue," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You don't need rescuing. You have made that plain every day since you arrived, and I have no desire to be the man who sweeps in and resolves things for a woman who is perfectly capable of resolving them herself." His voice was quiet and entirely level. "This is a question, asked by a man who has spent 11 days watching you, and concluded that he would spend the rest of his life regretting it if he didn't ask." The music in the Hargrove ballroom played on. The candles burned. 200 people circled and spoke and laughed around them, oblivious. "Abigail Reed," Nathaniel said. "Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, at his face, at the ring again. She thought about 18 months, and Pharaoh, and her cousin's full house, and 6 months of margin. She thought about the letter in Eleanor's possession, the fire, the sworn statement, her father's young frightened face, and the fact that if she said yes right now, Eleanor could still read that letter aloud, and the room would hear it, and nothing would stop it. She thought about her father, the gratitude in his prayers, a man who had done a wrong thing and spent his whole life after it, reaching for something better. She put out her hand. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit the way things fit when they were made for a purpose, and Abigail closed her hand around it and felt the cold metal warm against her skin, and thought, "Whatever comes next, I did not let shame make this decision." "I did." Nathaniel looked at her. She looked back. Then from across the room she heard the precise carrying voice of Eleanor Whitcomb say to the group assembled around her, "I wonder if I might have everyone's attention for just a moment." The music faltered. The conversation stilled. Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand move to the small of her back, not pushing, just present, just there. She lifted her chin. She had a ring on her finger, and a father she was not ashamed of, and the best posture she'd ever maintained in her life, and Eleanor Whitcomb was about to make her move in front of 200 witnesses, and Abigail Reed was not going to look at the floor. Whatever happened next, she was not going to look at the floor. Eleanor's voice did not rise. It never needed to. The particular quality of her delivery, that precision-cut clarity, every consonant placed like a pin in a map, did the work that volume would have made common. "I wonder if I might have everyone's attention for just a moment." The music stopped. Not immediately, not all at once, but instrument by instrument, the way a fire goes out when you take away the air. The conversations around them thinned. People turned. 200 people arranged themselves into an audience without being asked, because Eleanor Whitcomb had spent 60 years learning exactly how to make a room do that. Abigail felt Nathaniel's hand at her back. She did not move toward it. She did not move away. She stood where she was with her mother's pearls and her grandmother's ring, and whatever her father had left her that was worth more than either. And she watched Eleanor across the length of the Hargrove ballroom and waited. Eleanor's eyes found her, moved to Nathaniel, moved back to her. And something shifted. It was almost imperceptible. A fraction of recalculation, the kind that happens behind the eyes of a very controlled person when they take in new information and decide in the space of a breath what it costs. Eleanor had seen the ring. She had seen Abigail's hand closed around it. She had seen Nathaniel's hand at Abigail's back, and she had understood in the way she understood everything completely immediately, and without the luxury of being surprised by it. She had planned to read the letter. She did not read the letter. "I wanted to take a moment," Eleanor said into the waiting room, "to share something rather unexpected." Her voice was smooth as river ice. "My son has, it appears, made a decision this evening." She paused. "Miss Abigail Reed has consented to become his wife." The room exhaled, then filled with exactly the kind of sound a room full of Virginia society makes when it is processing a surprise and trying to decide in real time whether to approve of it. Mrs. Hargrove said loudly enough to settle the question for everyone. "Well now, Edmund always said that girl's father was the best man he knew. I'd say that's a fine recommendation." The room warmed. Not entirely. Not from Eleanor's corner, where several women exchanged looks with the careful speed of people updating their social calculations. But enough. Enough that the moment Eleanor's planned moment, her constructed and loaded and aimed moment, became something other than what she'd built it to be. Nathaniel was at Abigail's side within 10 seconds. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "She didn't read it," Abigail said. "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because reading it after the ring would have looked like spite," he said. "And whatever my mother is, she does not allow herself to look like that in public." Abigail looked across the room to where Eleanor stood, still holding her teacup, still wearing that face of controlled equanimity, now receiving the congratulations of a woman in yellow taffeta, with the expression of someone swallowing something they hadn't ordered. "She'll wait," Abigail said. "She hasn't finished." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "She hasn't." The carriage ride home was 12 miles of dark Virginia road, and a silence so precise you could have weighed it. Eleanor sat across from Abigail, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes directed at something outside the carriage window that was probably not the passing trees. Caroline, who had ridden with them at Nathaniel's quiet insistence, kept her own counsel with the self-possession of a woman who understood when her role was simply to exist as a buffer. Nathaniel sat beside Abigail. That was all. He sat beside her, not across from her, which was not the arrangement they had arrived in, and Eleanor noted it the way she noted everything completely and without visible reaction. At Whitcomb Hall, Eleanor descended from the carriage first and went directly upstairs without a word to any of them. Caroline touched Abigail's arm at the foot of the stairs. "Tonight was not how she planned it," she said quietly. "That will make tomorrow harder." "I know," Abigail said. "Is there anything I can do?" Abigail thought about it honestly. "Sleep well," she said, "so that at least one of us is rested." Caroline almost smiled. Then she went upstairs, and Nathaniel walked Abigail to the foot of the east staircase and stopped there, and they stood for a moment in the hallway with the house quiet around them and the candles burning low. "Whatever she does next," he said, "I want you to come to me. Don't handle it alone." "I handle things alone," Abigail said. "It's something of a habit." "I know. I'm asking you to consider breaking it." She looked at him. At his face, tired again, that accumulated tiredness, and underneath it, something else she didn't allow herself to name yet. "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. "Good night, Abigail." She went upstairs and lay on the carved walnut bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her and thought about her father and a fire and a sworn statement and 20 years of prayers that now had a shape she hadn't known before tonight. She did not sleep. By 3 in the morning, she had stopped trying. She rose dressed in her simplest day dress, took a candle, and went quietly down the east staircase, not toward the library. She knew where she was going. She had known for the past 2 hours, lying in the dark, working through it, and she had arrived at the only answer that felt like herself. Eleanor's private writing room was on the ground floor south wing between the main parlor and the garden door. Abigail had passed it a dozen times. She had never gone in. The door was not locked. She stood in the doorway for a moment, candle raised. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something faintly floral lavender, maybe dried and kept in a sachet somewhere she couldn't see. The writing desk was large, dark walnut, the surface clear except for a brass inkstand and a correspondence box with a brass latch. She did not go to the desk. She pulled out the chair at the small side table, the one with the portable writing slope, the kind you use for personal letters rather than estate correspondence. And she sat down, and she took paper from the stack beside it, and she dipped the pen, and she began to write. She wrote for nearly an hour. She was on her 4th page when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was writing because the sentence mattered, because she had chosen every word in it carefully, and she was not going to let Eleanor's entrance corrupt it. Then she looked up. Eleanor stood in the doorway in her dressing gown, a candle in one hand, and the particular expression of a woman who expected to find the room empty and has instead found something she didn't plan for. Her hair was down gray and white, longer than Abigail had imagined, falling past her shoulders. Without the black silk and the careful dressing it carried, she looked older. Not weaker, just older, more human. They looked at each other. "You're not stealing it," Eleanor said. Not a question. "No." Eleanor looked at the paper in front of Abigail, at the pen in her hand. "You're writing." "Yes." Eleanor came into the room. She sat down, not at her desk, but in the armchair near the window, which put her at the same level as Abigail, rather than above her. And Abigail didn't think that was an accident, but she didn't say so. Eleanor set her candle on the side table. "What are you writing?" she said. "A letter," Abigail said. "To you." Eleanor's expression did not change. "You could simply speak." "I could," Abigail agreed. "But I wanted to get it right. And I don't entirely trust myself to get it right out loud at 3 in the morning after tonight." She looked down at the pages. "May I read it to you?" A pause. "If you like," Eleanor said. Abigail smoothed the pages. She breathed once, then she read. "Mrs. Whitcomb, I am not going to read your letter. I have thought about it every hour since I learned of its existence, and I have arrived at the conclusion that reading it changes nothing that matters and everything that doesn't. My father made a mistake when he was 20 years old. He lied possibly to protect himself or someone else, and he spent the next 4 decades of his life becoming a man who would not have done it. I will not pretend the mistake did not exist. I will also not pretend it defines him, because I watched him for 23 years, and I know what defined him, and it was not the worst thing he ever did." Eleanor's hands were very still in her lap. Abigail continued. "I will not be made to feel that the conditions of my birth or the errors of my father's youth disqualify me from dignity. Not in this house or any other. I did not come here to be approved of. I came here because your husband made a promise to my father, and promises do not expire because the person who made them has died. I intend to hold this estate to that promise, whether I am welcomed here or not." She turned the page. "I am going to marry your son. Not because of the ring or the ball or the 12 people who witnessed it tonight. Because he is a man of genuine character, who looked at me in that parlor when my knee was on your floor, and did not calculate whether helping me was convenient. That is not a common quality. I have no intention of walking away from it, because you are afraid." She heard Eleanor take a breath. "I know you are afraid," Abigail said, and she looked up from the paper because this part she needed to say to Eleanor's face, not to the page. "I know this house is afraid. Not of me, not really. Of what I represent, of change. Of Nathaniel choosing something you didn't arrange." She held Eleanor's gaze. "I know what it costs to run a house like this after the man who built it is gone. I know what it costs to hold everything together by yourself and to discover that the person you've been holding it together for has made a decision without you. I am not your enemy, Mrs. Whitcomb. I am simply the person your son chose." Eleanor's jaw was set. Her eyes were very bright, which was not the same as soft. Eleanor Whitcomb's eyes being bright was not a sign of softness. It was something else. "And if I read that letter tomorrow," Eleanor said, "if I call on every connection I have in this county and give them every particular of your father's history, then I will leave this room," Abigail said, "and I will go home, and I will instruct a lawyer in Richmond to pursue the inheritance through the courts, which you have now made considerably more difficult by making the estate's position a matter of public record with the Hargroves as witnesses. And I will marry your son from my cousin's house in Richmond and come back to Whitcomb Hall as its mistress, and we will all three live with what that cost." She paused. "Or you can burn the letter." The clock on the mantel ticked. Outside, something moved in the garden, a night-bird wind in the boxwoods, something alive. "You would do it," Eleanor said. "Leave." "Yes." "And Nathaniel would let you go." "Nathaniel would follow me to Richmond in 3 days," Abigail said, "and you know that better than I do." Eleanor looked at her for a long time. The kind of looking that is not hostile, but is not comfortable either. The kind that happens when a person is genuinely seeing something for the first time and is deciding what to do with what they see. "You are nothing like I expected," Eleanor said. Her voice was different, not softer, just different the way a road changes when it stops being paved. "You said that at breakfast," Abigail said. "The first morning. I meant it as a complaint then." A pause. "I am less certain what I mean by it now." Abigail set the pages down on the writing slope. "What were you expecting?" "Someone easier," Eleanor said. Then, with the brevity of a woman who has not made a habit of explaining herself, "Someone I could manage." "And when you realized you couldn't?" Eleanor was quiet. The clock ticked again. She reached up and pressed 2 fingers briefly to the space between her eyes, and for the first time since Abigail had arrived in this house, Eleanor Whitcomb looked tired. Not the composed tiredness Nathaniel carried. Something older. Something that had been going on longer. "Edmund," she said, "was the only person who ever managed me." She said it the way people say things they haven't said before carefully, like testing weight on a board you're not sure will hold. "He was the only person in 35 years who looked at me directly and wasn't afraid of what he saw and didn't try to change it." She paused. "When he died, She stopped. "I held this house together because that was what there was to do. I made the decisions. I managed Nathaniel's grief and Samuel's grief, and the tenants and the solicitors and the correspondence and every last thing that needed managing, because that is what I know how to do." "I know," Abigail said quietly. "And then Nathaniel started talking about you," Eleanor said. "About Edmund's letter. About a woman he had never met, who was going to come, and I could see it. Before you even arrived, I could see the shape of it." Her voice had gone flat. Not cold. Flat the way voices go when they're describing something they observed and couldn't stop. "He would choose you. I knew it the moment he described the letter, the way he spoke about it, about the obligation, about doing right by Edmund's word." Her jaw tightened briefly. "He was already choosing you before you walked through my door." Abigail said nothing. "I thought if I could show him that you came with too much," Eleanor said. "The station, the father, something. I thought if there was enough attached to you, he would reconsider." She looked at Abigail. "I was not prepared for you to be—" She stopped. "What?" Abigail said. "Worthy of it," Eleanor said. The words came out like something that had cost her something. Not performed, not conceited. Just honest in the particular way of a woman who has not been honest about this thing in a very long time, and feels the strange relief of it even as it costs her. "I was not prepared for you to be worthy of my son." The fire had burned down to coals, and the candles had shortened by an inch, and the night outside was beginning its slow negotiation toward morning. And Abigail sat at the small side table in Eleanor Whitcomb's writing room, and felt something she hadn't felt since she'd arrived at this house. Something like solid ground. "I have been cruel to you," Eleanor said. Not an apology yet, an acknowledgement. "I arranged the parlor to break you. I wrote to your father's old county before you arrived. I commissioned the information specifically. I was looking for something to use, and I found it, and I carried it here, and I was going to use it tonight." She held Abigail's gaze. "That is not the behavior of a woman with good reasons. That is the behavior of a woman who is afraid and has mistaken her fear for authority. The clock. The coals. The first pale suggestion of light at the bottom of the garden window. Abigail picked up the letter she'd written and held it for a moment. Then she set it in front of Eleanor. "The letter my father wrote your husband," she said. "Where is it?" Eleanor looked at the writing desk. She rose from the armchair, went to the desk, opened the correspondence box, and removed a folded paper. She held it for a moment, without looking at it. Then she looked at it, one long look, the look of someone saying goodbye to a weapon they've carried a long time, and she crossed to the fireplace and set it on the coals. They both watched it catch. It went quickly the way old paper does. A line of flame. Then the whole thing. Then nothing but a curl of ash that broke apart when the heat reached it. Eleanor stood at the fireplace with her hands at her sides. "I have been cruel," she said again to the fire now, because cruelty was easier than being wrong. "I have been—" She stopped. Her voice had gone rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Edmund would have hated what I did in that parlor. He would have hated it more than anything I've done in 35 years. A breath. He was a better person than I am. He generally was. Abigail rose from the chair and stood beside her at the fireplace. "My father was not always a better person than his worst moment," she said. "He spent his whole life trying to be. I think that's what your husband saw in him. I think that's why he wrote the letter." She paused. Two men each trying to make right something they'd let go wrong, in the only way they had left. Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. They stood together at the fireplace in the gray pre-dawn, and the ash from the letter had gone cold, and the house around them was still. "He named Samuel himself," Eleanor said at last. "Did you know that Nathaniel's brother James wanted to name the boy something else? But Nathaniel said if it's a boy, his name is Samuel. He'd been certain from the beginning." She paused. "He has always known what he wanted, from the time he was this tall." She held her hand at the approximate height of a 10-year-old. "He does not waver. I used to think that was stubbornness. Edmund said it was character." A pause. "Edmund was right. Edmund was frequently right." "Are you often wrong?" Abigail asked. The question was direct enough that it hung in the air between them for a moment. Then Eleanor said, "More often than I have been willing to admit." She looked at Abigail. "Not frequently, but in the things that have mattered most, yes." Outside a bird began, then another. The garden was waking up. Eleanor straightened. The tiredness was still there, but she was straightening anyway, the way certain people do not performing composure but finding it again from habit. From something built so deep, it's not a choice anymore. "The inheritance," she said, "will be processed by the end of the month. I will speak to Pharaoh directly. There will be no further delay." She paused. "And the room across the landing from Samuel, the blue room, east-facing, is larger than the one you've been given. It has a better writing table." She looked at Abigail with that flat, precise gaze. "If you intend to stay, you should have a room appropriate to your position." Abigail looked at her. "I intend to stay," she said. Eleanor nodded once. "Then I will tell Mrs. Bell to begin moving your things today." She picked up her candle, which had burned to almost nothing. "I expect you would like a few hours of sleep before breakfast." "I would, yes." "Then go." She paused with her hand on the doorframe. "Abigail." It was the first time she had used her name. Not Miss Reed. Not said around her about her. Directly to her. Abigail stopped. "My son," Eleanor said, "has never in his life made a decision that I was proud of before I'd already decided to be proud of it." She paused. This was the first. Abigail held Eleanor's gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Good night, Mrs. Whitcomb." "Good morning," Eleanor corrected with the precision of a woman who even in this cannot help but be exact. Abigail went upstairs. She passed Samuel's door, saw the thin line of light beneath it, because Samuel had apparently also not slept, and she stopped and knocked once softly. The door opened 3 inches. Samuel looked up at her with his dark Whitcomb eyes, and the exhausted solemnity of a 9-year-old who has been awake worrying about adults. "Is it all right?" he said. Abigail looked at him. This boy with his fish books, and his secret named Colt, and his months without the river. It's going to be all right, she said. Samuel thought about this with his characteristic gravity. Then he said, "Will you still take me to the river?" "Tomorrow," she said. "After breakfast. We'll go together." He nodded satisfied and closed the door. Abigail went to the blue room. It had already apparently been assigned to her in Eleanor's mind before this morning, which was the most Eleanor thing she could imagine. And she lay down on a bed she hadn't yet slept in, and looked at the ceiling, and felt the ring on her finger, and heard the birds outside, deciding it was morning, and thought about her father, and all the ways a person can spend a life trying to be better than their worst moment, and thought that probably he would have understood all of this and been glad. She was asleep before the sun fully cleared the garden wall. She slept without dreaming, which was the best kind. She slept 4 hours and woke to the sound of Samuel knocking on the blue room door, with the patient persistence of a child who has been told to wait, and has waited as long as he intends to. "You said after breakfast," he said when she opened the door. "It's after breakfast." Abigail looked at him. He was dressed boots-laced fishbook under his arm. He had the expression of someone who had decided that yesterday's uncertainties were yesterdays, and that today there was a river to get to. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. She was ready in 8. They went by the kitchen path, same as before, and this time Mrs. Bell watched them go from the kitchen doorway and said nothing at all, which was different from the first time. The first time, Mrs. Bell's silence had been the silence of a woman choosing not to intervene. This time, it was something else, not approval exactly, but acknowledgement. The specific quiet of a household that has felt its internal weather shift overnight and is still taking the measure of the new temperature. At the river, Samuel crouched at the bank with the focus of a boy conducting serious scientific inquiry and pointed to a spot downstream where a branch overhung the water. "There," he said. Abigail looked. A kingfisher sat on the branch. Small, impossibly colored, that specific blue-green that doesn't look real against a Virginia summer morning, perfectly still watching the water, with the absolute patience of a creature that does not doubt that what it is waiting for will come. "He was here last time too," Samuel said. "I didn't point him out because I wasn't sure you'd care about birds." "And now you're sure?" Samuel considered her with the gravity that was, she had decided, simply the natural shape of his mind. "You came back," he said. "People who come back care about things." Abigail sat down on the bank beside him and watched the kingfisher, and thought that there was probably no better philosophy available at this hour of the morning. "Samuel," she said, "what would you say if I told you I was going to marry your uncle?" He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the kingfisher. "I'd say I already knew," he said. "He told me last Tuesday that he was going to ask you." She turned to look at him. "He told you before he asked me. He said he wanted to know if I thought it was a good idea." A pause. "I said yes." "What convinced you?" Samuel finally looked at her. "The river," he said simply. "The first time. You didn't ask me any questions about the house or grandmother or the money. You just listened." He looked back at the water. "Uncle Nathaniel listens the same way. I thought you'd probably be all right together." Abigail looked at the river for a moment, at the kingfisher still motionless on its branch. "I think we'll probably be all right together too," she said. The kingfisher dropped from the branch in a streak of color and hit the water and came up with something silver in its beak and was gone upstream before either of them had fully processed what they'd seen. Samuel let out a long breath. "I've been watching for that for 3 weeks, he said. "Worth the wait?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Then, most things are." They walked back to the house with Samuel talking about Jupiter the Colt, and whether a horse named after a planet was obligated to be fast, and Abigail let him talk, and felt the morning settle around her like something she was allowed to have. Nathaniel was waiting at the top of the kitchen path. He looked at Abigail with an expression that said he knew, which meant Eleanor had told him, which meant Eleanor had gotten up before any of them, and done the harder thing first. "How much did she tell you?" Abigail asked. "Enough," he said. He looked at Samuel. Go find Mrs. Bell and tell her you want your second breakfast. You always want your second breakfast. Samuel looked between them with the shrewd assessment of a child who knows when adults need privacy and is deciding whether to provide it. He decided. Fine, he said, and went inside. Nathaniel looked at Abigail. She burned it, he said. She told me this morning. She said... He stopped. She said she owed you an apology that she intended to deliver properly, and that she was working out how to do it in a way that was adequate to the offense. He paused. That is my mother's way of saying she's genuinely sorry. The word adequate is important. It means she's measuring against the actual size of what she did. I know, Abigail said. I'm beginning to understand how she measures things. Nathaniel looked at her with the expression she had stopped trying not to name. You were up all night. Parts of it. What were you writing? She had not expected him to ask that specifically. She thought about the 4 pages of careful, honest letter sitting on the writing slope in Eleanor's room, and whether Eleanor had read the whole thing after she left, and what it had cost her if she had. Everything I should have been able to say out loud, she said. But couldn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I should have told you about the letter when I found you that first night in the library. Yes, she agreed. I was trying to protect you from it. I know. That was the wrong instinct, even though it came from the right place. She looked at him directly. I need you to trust that I can bear hard things, Nathaniel. Not because I'm not afraid of them, because I've been bearing them my whole life, and I haven't come apart yet. He held her gaze. I know that now. Then we understand each other. We do, he said. And then, because he was a man who did not repeat things that had already been settled, come inside. You haven't eaten. She went inside. The household had shifted. That was the only word for it. The particular atmosphere of Whitcomb Hall that controlled correct pressurized quiet had changed overnight in some way that Abigail could feel but not entirely articulate. It was in the way the footman at the front door looked at her, in the way the parlor maid moved aside in the corridor without the half-second calculation she'd been doing all week, in the way Mrs. Bell set Abigail's place at the breakfast table at Nathaniel's left without being asked and without the commentary of placement. Something had been decided. The house knew it. Caroline came downstairs with her traveling hat already on. Abigail saw it and stopped. You're leaving, she said. My carriage is at 10, Caroline said. I was going to find you before I went. She looked at Abigail steadily, that frank, direct look she had undecorated. Are you all right? I'm better than I was yesterday. Good. Caroline set down her bag and looked at her. I want to say something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, and not any other way. She paused. I came here because Eleanor asked me. I knew why she asked me. I let myself be used as part of an argument that was not fair to either of us, and I am not proud of that. She paused. But I also want you to know that if she had succeeded, if Nathaniel had looked at you and looked at me and chosen what his mother arranged, I would not have been happy. Not because I don't value marriage or position. Because I have watched Nathaniel Whitcomb for 3 days. And I know a man who has already decided, and I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I was the consolation to a decision he hadn't made. She met Abigail's eyes. You are not a consolation. You are the decision. There's a difference. Abigail looked at her for a moment. You would have been all right, Caroline, whatever happened. I know, Caroline said simply. That's what I mean. She picked up her bag. Write to me. I should like to know you better if you're willing. I'm willing, Abigail said. Caroline nodded once, with the particular economy of a woman who doesn't linger on things once they're settled. Then she walked to the front door and got into her carriage and drove away, and Abigail watched her go and thought that the world had a way of putting decent people in your path at the moments when you most needed to be reminded they existed. The morning passed the way mornings do after nights that have cost something slowly at first, then all at once. Abigail ate breakfast. She spoke to Mrs. Bell about the moving of her things to the blue room. She sat with Samuel for an hour while he drew increasingly inaccurate illustrations of kingfishers in the margins of his fish book, and defended each one with total conviction. And then at 11:30, Eleanor appeared in the doorway of the parlor where Abigail was reading. She was dressed in black as always. Her hair was immaculate. Her posture was what it had always been, the posture of a woman who had decided decades ago that she would not allow her body to make arguments her mind hadn't approved. But something else was different. "Would you walk with me?" Eleanor said. "In the garden, if you have a moment." Abigail set down her book. "Of course." They went out through the garden door and into the July heat, and they walked side by side along the boxwood path in the particular way of two women who have not yet established their stride together and are working it out in real time. Eleanor spoke first. "I called the household together this morning," she said, "before you came down to breakfast." Abigail glanced at her. "Mrs. Bell, the housemaids, the footmen, the groundskeeper." Eleanor kept her eyes on the path. "I told them that Miss Reed would be mistress of this house, and that any discourtesy shown to her from this day forward in any form would be answered to me personally." She paused. "I also told them that the discourtesy shown to her in the front parlor on her first afternoon was not in keeping with the standards of this household, and that it would not be repeated." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Eleanor said. "That is precisely why I did it." They walked a few more steps. The garden was lush and heavy in the summer heat, and a bee moved through the roses with total indifference to human drama. "My husband would have done it immediately," Eleanor said. "The morning after that parlor scene, he would have stood in that entrance hall and said his piece and been done with it. Edmund was never afraid of being wrong. He had a gift for it." Something moved through her voice, just briefly. Something that had been living in her for 18 months. "I have never had that gift. Being wrong has always cost me more than it costs other people. I don't entirely know why." "Perhaps," Abigail said carefully, "because the people around you have always let you be right." Eleanor looked at her sharply. Then slowly something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. "That," she said, "is an uncomfortable observation." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. You're not wrong." A pause. "You have a habit of being right that I find extremely inconvenient." "I learned it from my father," Abigail said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father sounds like he was a genuinely good man." "He was," Abigail said, "in the way that real people are good, not perfectly, not without cost, but persistently, with his whole self." Eleanor nodded once, and that was all that needed to be said about that. They came to the end of the boxwood path and turned back toward the house, and somewhere in the south wing, a door opened, and Nathaniel's voice carried something about the south field, about weather coming in, and Eleanor tilted her head slightly at the sound. "He sounds like Edmund when he's working," she said, more to herself than to Abigail. "I'll take your word for it," Abigail said. "You'll know soon enough," Eleanor said. "He works too hard. Edmund worked too hard. You'll have to learn when to pull him inside before he drives himself into the ground." She said it with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman handing over institutional knowledge. Not permission, knowledge. "The November harvest is the worst. He won't leave the fields until everything is in, and then he'll be ill for 3 days because he didn't sleep, and he'll deny he's ill, and you'll have to pretend to believe him while making him drink broth until he admits it." Abigail looked at her. "You've been doing that alone for 30 years. "Not alone," Eleanor said. "Edmund did his share, and then after him—" A pause. "Yes, alone." They walked back toward the house in the heat, and the bee sound, and the rustling of the boxwoods, and something passed between them on that path that was not forgiveness. Yet forgiveness would take longer, and Eleanor was not a woman who did anything quickly that deserved to be done carefully, but was the thing that comes before forgiveness. Recognition. The specific recognition of two women who are both of them stronger than the situation required, and lonelier than they had admitted, and who have decided without ceremony to stop being strangers. That afternoon, Abigail packed a bag. Not her trunk. One bag. The traveling bag she had carried in from the Richmond Road on the first day, the one that had her father's oilcloth and her mother's second pair of gloves, and the Marcus Aurelius she hadn't finished. Nathaniel found her with it in her hand, standing by the blue room window. He stopped in the doorway. "Where are you going?" he said, not alarmed, just direct. "I don't know yet," she said. "Richmond, maybe, a few days." He came into the room. "Why?" She looked at him. She had been trying to find the words for this since she woke up, and she still wasn't sure she had the right ones, but she had learned in the past 2 weeks that imperfect, honest words were better than perfect, careful silence. "Because you proposed to me at the Hargrove ball with your mother across the room, about to read a letter about my father," she said. "And I said yes because I meant it, and I still mean it, but I want—" She stopped. "I want you to choose it again, without the urgency. Without me standing right in front of you, and the room watching, and the moment requiring an answer." She held his gaze. "I want you to have a week of ordinary mornings without me in your house, and at the end of it, if you still want to marry me, I want you to come find me and say so. Without an audience. Without a crisis." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think I'll change my mind?" he said. "No," she said. "I think you won't. But I want you to know that too. With certainty, that comes from choosing freely rather than choosing under fire. And if I come to find you in 2 days instead of a week, then I'll know you're impatient," she said, "which I already know." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. That shape she had learned. Almost a smile, the precondition. "3 days," he said. "Fine. I'll come in 3 days." He looked at the bag in her hand. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." He reached out and touched the strap of the bag once, just briefly, just the back of his knuckles against the leather, and then stepped aside. She walked out. She told Samuel she was going to visit her cousin for a few days, and that she would bring him back a book about birds from Richmond if she could find one. He received this information with the dignified composure of a boy who is devastated and refusing to show it, which was so thoroughly a Whitcomb expression that she had to look away for a moment. She told Mrs. Bell that the blue room could stay as it was. She did not find Eleanor to say goodbye, because Eleanor was in her sitting room with the door closed, and some things did not require ceremony. She walked down the front steps of Whitcomb Hall and got into the hired carriage and rode toward Richmond, and did not look back, not because she was afraid of what she'd see, but because she already knew what was there, and she'd be back in 3 days, and some things you don't need to watch to believe in. He came in too. She was at her cousin's kitchen table on the second morning helping shell late summer beans and listening to her cousin's third child describe a frog he had found in alarming detail when the sound of a horse came up the road and then stopped. And her cousin looked at the window and then at Abigail with the expression of a woman who has suspected something and has just been proven right. Abigail went to the door. Nathaniel Whitcomb stood on the front path with his hat in his hand and the specific look of a man who has made a decision and is not interested in discussing whether it was the right one. "I said 3 days," Abigail said. "I know what you said." "You're early. I spent 1 full day not coming," he said. "At the end of it I went to bed and lay in the dark for 4 hours, and concluded that the exercise was making me considerably less rational rather than more, and that you had probably already reached the same conclusion about your own certainty that I had reached about mine, and that the remaining 2 days would be bad for both of us." He held her gaze. "I choose this. I chose it at the Hargrove ball, and I chose it the morning after, and I chose it yesterday, and I'm choosing it now without urgency and without an audience in your cousin's front yard." A pause. "Is that sufficient?" Abigail looked at him for the length of one honest breath. "Come inside," she said. "You can help shell beans." He came inside. He was terrible at shelling beans. Her cousin's children found this hilarious. Abigail found it extraordinary, which she kept to herself. They rode back to Whitcomb Hall the next morning. The drive up from this gate was the same red Virginia clay road, the same iron gate, the same long approach to the house on its hill. but it was not the same as the first time. The first time she had walked it alone with ruined boots and everything to prove. This time, Nathaniel was beside her, and the gate was open, and the groundskeeper who had told her to use the side entrance was raking the drive and looked up and briefly, barely nodded. She nodded back. They came through the front door and into the entrance hall with its marble floors and walnut staircase, and the portraits of men who had never once been directed to the side entrance. Eleanor was waiting. She was standing in the middle of the hall, not at the top of the staircase where she could look down, not in the doorway of the parlor at a remove, in the hall itself on the marble floor where everyone stood, and behind her, at a respectful but visible distance, Mrs. Bell. Two housemaids, the footman, the groundskeeper who must have come in through the back, Samuel at the foot of the stairs with his hands in his pockets and his dark eyes very bright. The whole household. Abigail stopped. Nathaniel had gone still beside her. Eleanor looked at Abigail. The black silk, the white hair, those precise dark eyes. And then Eleanor Whitcomb in front of every person in her household in the entrance hall that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, put her hands at her sides, bent her knees and curtsied. Not a shallow acknowledgement, not the nod of a woman meeting a social equal. The deep, full curtsy of genuine respect, the kind that costs a woman of 60 in her bones and in her pride, held for a count of 3, and then she rose. The hallway was perfectly silent. Nathaniel moved. A small movement, he drew breath about to speak. Abigail put her hand on his arm. "Let her finish," she said quietly. Eleanor straightened to her full height. She looked at Abigail directly. "I once asked Miss Reed to lower herself before me," she said in that carrying, precise voice. "In this hall, in front of witnesses." She did not look away. "I was wrong." Another silence. Samuel made a small sound. Not crying. Just the involuntary noise of someone whose held breath has finally found its way out. Abigail stepped forward. She crossed the marble floor and stood before Eleanor Whitcomb, and she looked at this woman, this difficult, controlled, frightened, proud, lonely woman who had burned a letter at 3 in the morning rather than let cruelty be the last thing she held, and she kissed her once on each cheek. "Welcome home, Mother," she said. Eleanor's hands came up. They gripped Abigail's arms firmly, briefly, the grip of someone steadying themselves on the only solid thing within reach. Her face did not break. Eleanor's face did not break. But her eyes were very bright, and her jaw was tight with something that was not anger, and was not coldness, and was something she was clearly going to take some time to make peace with in private. "Welcome home, Abigail," Eleanor said. Mrs. Bell cleared her throat somewhere behind them, not from discomfort, but from the specific refinement of a woman signaling that the emotional peak has been reached, and it might be time to let the moment breathe. Samuel crossed the marble floor at a speed that suggested he had been holding himself back by considerable effort, and hugged Abigail around the middle, with the unself-conscious force of a child who has given up caring whether that was the correct thing to do. "I told Jupiter you were coming back," he said into her side. "He didn't seem particularly interested, but I thought he should know." Abigail put her arms around him and looked over the top of his head at Nathaniel, who was standing by the door with his hat still in his hand, and the expression of a man watching something he will remember for the rest of his life, and knows it. She looked at Eleanor, who had turned slightly away, ostensibly to speak to Mrs. Bell about something practically, to give herself 30 seconds to be something other than composed. She looked at the entrance hall, the white marble, the walnut staircase, the portraits, the same hall where she had once knelt with shaking knees and kept her chin level because her father had told her that a woman who holds her head up in shame is the only one in the room worth looking at. He had been right. The wedding was held 6 weeks later in September, when the Virginia heat had gone golden and tolerable, and the river near the South Path was running clear and unhurried. They were married in the Whitcomb Hall garden, which was Eleanor's suggestion, and no one argued with it. The household attended. Mrs. Hargrove attended loudly and with genuine pleasure. Caroline Mercer attended from Charlottesville, and embraced Abigail at the gate, and said only, "I told you the pearls were right." Samuel stood beside Nathaniel and managed the rings with the focused gravity of someone who has been given an important job and intends to perform it correctly. When the minister asked if there were any objections, Samuel looked around the assembled guests with an expression that made 3 people laugh. There were no objections. Eleanor sat in the front in her black silk with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on her son's face, and she did not cry because she was Eleanor Whitcomb, and she did not cry at events. But when Nathaniel looked at her at the conclusion of the ceremony, a brief straight look, man to mother, the way they had always communicated the things that mattered. She put her hand briefly over her heart and then removed it and returned to her composed expression. And only Abigail, standing right there, saw it happen. That evening, after the guests had gone and Samuel had fallen asleep in the library armchair, with the bird book Abigail had brought from Richmond open on his chest, and Mrs. Bell had done the last of the evening's management and gone to her own quarters, Abigail stood in the entrance hall of Whitcomb Hall, alone. The marble was cool underfoot. The candles were low. Outside, the September night was moving in with the first real edge of autumn in it, that particular smell, that change in the air that comes when the season decides it's time. She had come here with 1 trunk, 1 pair of gloves, and her late father's reputation. She had come for a legal obligation, and a sum of money, and the right to stand on ground that no one could take from her. She had knelt on this floor, and she had risen from it, and she had spent 2 weeks in this house, watching it decide one person at a time what kind of place it intended to be. She heard Nathaniel's step on the staircase above her. She didn't look up yet. She looked at the floor, the white marble, the gray veins, the cold and beautiful indifference of it. And she thought of her father, and the fire, and the 30 years of prayers, and the letter written to make something right, and Edmund Whitcomb, who had looked at a preacher from a small county and seen a man worth honoring. Some debts, her father used to say, don't go away when the person you owe them to does. They just change hands. She looked up. Nathaniel was at the top of the staircase, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, like something he had chosen fully with his whole self, and had no intention of unchoosing, and he held out his hand. She crossed the marble floor. She had walked it ashamed, and she had walked it defiant, and she had walked it uncertain, and she had walked it alone. She walked it now with her head up, and her mother's pearls, and her grandmother's ring, and everything she had ever held on to, still intact, every piece of it, earned none of it,